There's a strange kind of stillness that settles over your life right before everything changes. You probably won't recognize it while you're inside it. It feels too much like failure, too much like stagnation, too much like the universe forgot about you and moved on to someone more deserving. Everything you've been working towards seems to have stalled. Relationships that once sustained you feel hollow. The version of yourself you spent years constructing doesn't fit anymore, like a coat you've outgrown but keep wearing because you don't know who you'd be without it. And somewhere underneath all of that heaviness, there's a quiet voice you keep trying to ignore. One that whispers, "This life you built isn't the life you were supposed to be living." Carl Jung spent his career studying people in exactly this kind of moment. He saw hundreds of patients arrive at his door during what looked, from the outside, like the worst period of their lives. Careers dissolving, marriages crumbling, identities fracturing. The people around them saw crisis. Their families saw breakdown. The world saw someone falling apart. But Jung saw something else entirely when he looked at these patients. He recognized a pattern so consistent, so unmistakable, that he came to trust it more than almost anything else in his decades of psychological work. The pattern was this: the period that looks most like an ending is almost always the threshold of a profound beginning. And the more complete the dissolution feels, the more significant the chapter that's trying to emerge on the other side of it. Today I'm going to walk you through what Jung discovered about this threshold period, why it happens, what it's actually doing to your psyche, the specific signs that you're standing at the edge of a transformation most people never complete, and what becomes possible if you can resist the urge to run back to the life that's already dying behind you. Jung had a word for what happens to people during this threshold. He called it the nigredo, a term he borrowed from alchemy, which he studied obsessively because he believed the alchemists had stumbled onto psychological truths centuries before psychology existed as a discipline. In alchemical tradition, the nigredo is the blackening phase. It's the stage where the base material has to decompose completely before it can be transformed into something of genuine value. The alchemists understood that you can't refine gold from ore without first breaking down the ore. The structure has to dissolve. The original form has to be destroyed. And that destruction looks, from every angle, like pure loss. Jung recognized that human psyches go through the same process. There are periods in a person's life where everything that constituted their identity, their roles, their relationships, their beliefs about who they are and what their life means, begins to break down. And the person experiencing this breakdown almost always interprets it as something going terribly wrong. They think they've made catastrophic mistakes. They think they're being punished. They think they've wasted their best years. They think the darkness settling over their life is the final chapter of a story that never quite worked out. What Jung kept seeing again and again was that this interpretation was almost perfectly backwards. The darkness wasn't a punishment. It was a preparation. The psyche was clearing ground for something that couldn't grow in the soil of the old life. Think about what happens in nature during winter. Everything above ground dies or goes dormant. The landscape looks barren, lifeless. If you didn't understand seasons, you'd assume the earth was finished producing anything. But underneath that frozen surface, the soil is restructuring. Nutrients are redistributing. Root systems are deepening in ways they never could during the busy growing season. The apparent death is actually the condition for the next period of growth that will be deeper and more vital precisely because of how thorough the winter was. Jung saw the same dynamic operating in his patients. The ones who arrived looking most destroyed were often the ones closest to their most significant transformation. Their old identity had to die because it was too small to contain what was trying to emerge. Their relationships had to shift because those relationships were calibrated to the person they were becoming rather than the person they were still trying to be. Their sense of meaning had to collapse because the meaning they'd been living by was borrowed, inherited from parents, absorbed from culture, constructed from fear rather than from any genuine encounter with their own depths. And here's what made Jung's observations so radical for his time, and still so radical now. He didn't see this breakdown as something to be fixed. He didn't rush to medicate the depression or resolve the crisis or restore the patient to their previous functioning. He recognized that the breakdown was the healing. The dissolution was the process. The darkness was doing exactly what it needed to do. This goes against everything we've been taught about difficulty. We live in a culture that treats any form of suffering as a malfunction. Something hurts, fix it. Something's falling apart, put it back together. You feel lost. Find the answer quickly before the discomfort becomes unbearable. And there's a massive industry built around this impulse. Self-help books promising rapid transformation, programs offering 3 steps to your best life, coaches guaranteeing they can accelerate you past the painful parts into the shiny result on the other side. Jung would have looked at all of this and recognized it as the ego's desperate attempt to avoid the one thing that could actually transform it. Because the ego doesn't want transformation. The ego wants improvement. It wants to become a better version of itself while remaining fundamentally the same. It wants to add new skills, new relationships, new achievements to its existing structure without ever questioning whether that structure needs to come down entirely. Real transformation, what Jung called individuation, requires something the ego finds absolutely terrifying. It requires letting the old structure collapse without immediately replacing it with a new one. It requires tolerating a period of not knowing who you are, what you want, or where you're going. It requires standing in the threshold between your old life and your new one, without rushing through to the other side just because the in-between is unbearable. And this is where most people lose the transformation that's trying to happen. They can't tolerate the threshold. The uncertainty is too much. The loss of identity is too frightening. The absence of clear direction feels too much like evidence that they've failed. So, they retreat. They go back to the relationship that was dying. They recommit to the career that was suffocating them. They rebuild the persona they'd finally started shedding. They choose the familiar pain over the unfamiliar possibility because at least the familiar pain has a shape they recognize. Jung watched this happen constantly, and it grieved him. He'd see someone standing at the very edge of genuine transformation, the old life crumbling, the new self stirring underneath, and then they'd panic. They'd grab onto the wreckage of what was falling apart and try to reassemble it. And they'd succeed, sort of. They'd get the relationship back on shaky ground. They'd recommit to the career with renewed but hollow determination. They'd reconstruct a version of the person they used to be. And from the outside, it would look like recovery, like they'd weathered the storm and come through intact. But Jung knew better. He knew that the storm wasn't something to weather, it was something to surrender to. And the people who retreated from the threshold would carry a specific kind of pain for the rest of their lives. The pain of sensing deep in their bones that there was a version of their life they almost lived, a self they almost became, a chapter that was trying to begin but they wouldn't let it. So if you're in that place right now, the place where everything feels like it's falling apart, where your old identity doesn't fit, where you can't see where you're going and you can't go back to where you were, Jung would want you to know something. You're not in a crisis, you're in a threshold. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a life that keeps repeating its old patterns and a life that finally breaks through into something genuine. Let me describe what this threshold actually looks like, because it's more specific than you might expect. Jung identified distinct psychological markers that consistently appeared in people who were approaching a major life transformation. These markers often looked like symptoms of something going wrong, which is why they're so commonly misread, by the person experiencing them, by their families, by therapists who don't understand what they're witnessing. The first marker is a creeping sense of meaninglessness in things that used to matter. You wake up and the life you've built, the one that looked right on paper, that met all the criteria for success, feels hollow, like a set for a play that's already ended. You go through the motions because you don't know what else to do, but the emotional connection to your routines, your goals, even your relationships, has thinned to almost nothing. People around you don't notice because you're still performing, but inside, you feel like you're watching your own life from a slight distance, and what you see doesn't make sense to you anymore. Jung recognized this hollowing out as the psyche withdrawing its energy from the structures the ego built. When something has served its purpose in your psychological development, the life force starts pulling back from it. the way sap retreats from branches in autumn. The branches don't break, they just go dry, and the energy that used to flow into them starts pooling somewhere deeper, somewhere you can't access yet, preparing to fuel something you can't see. The second marker is an increase in dreams, strange thoughts, and eruptions from the unconscious. You start dreaming vividly, dreams that feel significant even when they don't make logical sense. Memories surface that you haven't thought about in decades. Emotions appear that seem to come from nowhere. You might find yourself crying for no reason, or feeling waves of anger that don't connect to anything happening in your present life. Old wounds you thought you dealt with start aching again, as if they'd only been dormant, not healed. Jung understood these eruptions as the unconscious making its move. When the ego's grip on consciousness loosens, when the old identity starts losing its hold, the unconscious material that was suppressed underneath that identity begins rising to the surface. Everything you tucked away, every feeling you didn't have time for, every part of yourself you rejected to fit into the life you built, all of it starts coming up. And it's overwhelming because it's been compressed for years, sometimes decades. The pressure behind it is enormous. The third marker is a profound pull towards solitude that everyone in your life misinterprets. You start canceling plans. You spend more time alone. Social situations that used to energize you feel like they're draining something essential from you. You're not depressed exactly. You just can't be around people without feeling like you're losing something. Like every interaction requires you to perform a version of yourself that's becoming impossible to sustain. Jung saw this withdrawal as a necessary conservation of psychological energy. Transformation requires enormous internal resources, and the psyche begins redirecting energy away from external engagement toward the internal restructuring that's underway. Your need for solitude during this period is as legitimate as a body's need for rest during illness. Something inside you is being rebuilt, and that process requires you to stop giving your energy away to everything and everyone else. The fourth marker, and this one is perhaps the most disturbing to experience, is the sense that you're becoming someone you don't recognize. Your tastes change, your values shift. Things you used to care about desperately start feeling irrelevant. People you used to admire start looking different to you. The goals that drove you for years lose their pull, and nothing has emerged to replace them yet. You look in the mirror and the person staring back feels like a stranger, someone you're in the process of meeting but haven't been properly introduced to. Jung would have called this the emergence of the self, the deeper, more authentic center of the psyche that exists beneath the ego's constructed identity. When the ego's structure weakens, the self starts exerting its influence. And because the self represents who you actually are, rather than who you learn to perform, its emergence feels foreign. You've spent your whole life being someone constructed from expectations, survival strategies, and cultural conditioning. Meeting the person underneath all that construction is disorienting in the extreme. If you're experiencing several of these markers simultaneously, you're in the threshold. You're standing in the space between who you were and who you're becoming. And what happens next depends entirely on whether you can resist the almost unbearable urge to retreat to familiar ground. If you've been feeling this pull towards something deeper, this sense that the life you've been living is somehow too small for what's stirring inside you, you might find real clarity in the reflection exercises from our guide, True Self-Discovery. 24 practices rooted in Jung's approach to self-understanding, designed to help you stop running from the threshold and start listening to what's trying to emerge. The link is right below this video. But for now, let's keep going, because there's something crucial about this threshold period that almost nobody talks about. The hardest part of the threshold isn't the loss. It isn't the confusion or the loneliness or the feeling of watching your old life disintegrate. The hardest part is the emptiness between what was and what's coming, because there's a gap. A real, terrifying, seemingly endless gap between the death of the old chapter and the birth of the new one. And during that gap, you have nothing to hold on to. Jung described this gap as a kind of psychological freefall. The structures you use to orient your life are gone or going. The identity you use to navigate the world has lost its coherence. your goals, your plans, your sense of what comes next, all of it has dissolved. And you're left in a void that the ego experiences as the most threatening thing imaginable. Because the ego survives through structure, through knowing, through having a plan, a role, a story. When all of that is stripped away, the ego goes into a kind of primal panic. This is the moment when most people break. They call the ex. They take the job they know will make them miserable. They apologize for changing and promise to go back to how they were. They do whatever it takes to end the free fall, even if ending it means landing right back in the life that was killing them slowly. Jung saw this flight from the gap as the great tragedy of psychological development, because the gap is where transformation actually happens. The void between identities is where the new self gestates. The emptiness that feels like nothing is actually the fertile darkness where something genuine, something that couldn't exist within the constraints of your old life, is taking shape. He compared it to the space between breaths. There's a moment after you exhale completely and before you inhale again where nothing is happening. No air moving in or out, complete stillness. And that moment of stillness is essential. Without it, the next breath can't begin. It needs the emptiness. It requires the pause. Trying to skip that pause by immediately gasping for air produces hyperventilation. Frantic, shallow breathing that feels like breathing but provides no real sustenance. This is exactly what happens when people rush through the threshold. They hyperventilate psychologically. They grab at new relationships before they've processed why the old ones ended. They leap into new careers before they've understood what they were actually running from. They construct a new identity before the old one has been fully mourned and released. And the life they build from this place of panic is shallow. It has the appearance of a new chapter, but it's really just the old chapter with different furniture. The people Jung saw emerge from genuine transformation were the ones who could tolerate the gap, who could sit in the void and resist filling it prematurely, who could bear the terrifying question of, who am I if I'm not the person I've been pretending to be, without rushing to answer it with the first available identity. This tolerance isn't passive. It's one of the most demanding psychological acts a person can perform. Sitting with uncertainty when every cell in your body screams for resolution. Holding the emptiness when your mind races to fill it with plans and projections. Letting yourself be nobody for a while when you've spent your entire life performing somebody. Jung talked about what he called the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to bridge the conscious and unconscious minds during periods of intense tension. When you can hold opposite states simultaneously, when you can feel lost and somehow trust the process, when you can grieve what's dying while staying open to what's being born, the transcendent function activates. And it produces something neither the conscious mind nor the unconscious could have created alone. It generates a new position, a new identity, a new way of being that integrates aspects of yourself you didn't even know existed. But the transcendent function only works when you're willing to hold the tension without collapsing into one side. If you retreat entirely into the old identity, you've resolved the tension artificially. If you leap prematurely into a new identity, you've bypassed the tension rather than working through it. The function requires you to stand in the middle, in the fire of not knowing, long enough for something genuinely new to emerge. And what emerges, Jung was consistent about this across decades of observation, is always bigger than what came before. The new chapter, when it's allowed to arrive on its own terms rather than being forced, carries a quality of authenticity that the old chapter never had. Because the old chapter was built from accommodation, from expectations, from survival strategies and cultural scripts and the collected should-haves of everyone who influenced your development. The new chapter is built from encounter with the self, from a genuine reckoning with who you actually are beneath all the performance. Let me tell you what this looks like in practice, because the abstract can only carry you so far. Picture someone, maybe someone a lot like you, who spent 15 years building a life that looked successful. Good career, good relationship, nice home, the respect of their community. All the markers of a life well lived. And then something started shifting. The career that once excited them started feeling like a cage. The relationship that once nourished them started feeling like a performance. They'd lie awake at 3 in the morning with this weight on their chest that they couldn't explain, because nothing was technically wrong. Everything was fine. Everything was exactly what they'd worked for. And that was the most terrifying part, realizing that getting everything they wanted still left them feeling empty. For a while, they tried to fix it from inside the existing structure, changed roles at work, tried couples therapy, took up new hobbies, traveled, exercised more, meditated, read self-help books by the stack, and each fix would produce a brief hit of relief before the emptiness seeped back in, a little deeper each time. Because none of these changes addressed what was actually happening. They were rearranging furniture in a house that needed to be rebuilt from the foundation. Then came the period Jung would recognize instantly. Everything started falling apart, and this time the fixes stopped working. The relationship that had been on life support finally ended. The career path that had felt suffocating became literally unbearable. Friendships that had been sustained by performance fell away when the person stopped performing, and they found themselves standing in the wreckage of the life they'd built, completely alone, completely disoriented, with absolutely no idea what came next. This is the threshold, this exact moment. And everyone looking at this person from the outside sees tragedy, sees failure, sees someone whose life fell apart. But Jung, looking at this same person, would see something entirely different. He'd see someone whose psyche had finally gathered enough force to break through the false structure. He'd see the nigredo in full effect, the necessary blackening that precedes the gold. He'd see someone standing in exactly the right place, even though that place feels like the worst place they've ever been. What happens next, if the person can hold the threshold, unfolds in ways they couldn't have predicted or planned. Because the new chapter doesn't arrive the way the old one did, through goal setting and strategy and careful construction. It arrives through emergence, through synchronicity, through a reorganization of priorities so fundamental that the person's entire orientation to life shifts. Jung noticed that people who completed this transition experienced what he called enantiodromia, the tendency of things to transform into their opposite at their point of greatest intensity. The period of deepest isolation often preceded the arrival of the most authentic connections of their life. The moment of most complete meaninglessness often gave birth to a sense of purpose more powerful than anything they'd experienced before. The time when they felt most lost often turned out to be the precise period when they were, for the first time, heading in the right direction. This pattern drove his more rational colleagues absolutely insane because it sounded mystical. But Jung wasn't being mystical. He was describing a psychological mechanism. When the ego's agenda finally exhausts itself, when all the plans and strategies and forced optimism run out of fuel, the deeper intelligence of the psyche gets a chance to express itself. And this deeper intelligence has been paying attention the whole time. It knows things about you that your conscious mind has been too busy performing to notice. It knows what genuinely fulfills you, who you actually are, what kind of life would feel like breathing after years of holding your breath. It just couldn't get through while the ego was running the show. The new chapter, when it comes, rarely looks like what the old self would have chosen. The person who spent 15 years climbing the corporate ladder might find themselves drawn to teaching, or creating, or community work, something that pays less but fills a space the old career never touched. The person who performed confidence and invulnerability might find themselves building relationships rooted in genuine vulnerability, relationships where being seen matters more than being admired. The person who spent their whole life trying to earn love might discover they're capable of generating it from within, and this discovery changes every relationship they'll ever have from that point forward. Jung called this the second half of life, though it doesn't necessarily correlate with chronological age. Some people reach this threshold at 30, others don't arrive until 60, and some never arrive at all, spending their entire lives in the first chapter, the chapter built from other people's expectations, never discovering what was waiting beneath it. What determines whether someone reaches this threshold has less to do with suffering than you might think. Plenty of people suffer enormously without ever approaching genuine transformation. The suffering just repeats. What brings someone to the threshold is a specific kind of honesty. The willingness to admit that the life they've built, despite all its apparent success, isn't working at the level that matters most. That the performance has become intolerable. That the gap between who they appear to be and who they actually are has widened to the point where maintaining the gap requires more energy than they can sustain. This honesty is devastating because it means looking at years, sometimes decades of choices, and acknowledging that those choices were driven by something other than authentic desire, by fear, by obligation, by the need for approval, by inherited scripts about what a good life looks like. There's no way to arrive at this recognition without feeling the weight of time spent building something that, in the end, wasn't really yours. But here's what Jung observed about people who could sit with that recognition instead of running from it. The weight transforms. The grief over time spent living someone else's script gradually becomes fuel for living your own. The regret doesn't disappear, but it changes character, from self-punishment into motivation, from "I wasted those years" into "I understand now what those years were teaching me, and I won't waste the ones I have left." Jung would never have described this process as easy. He would never have called it beautiful, at least not while you're inside it. He was too honest for that. He knew the threshold was brutal. He knew the gap between chapters was the loneliest place a human being could stand. He knew the ego's death throes were agonizing, and that the temptation to retreat was almost irresistible. But he also knew, with the certainty of someone who'd watched this process unfold in hundreds of lives, including his own, that the chapter waiting on the other side was worth every moment of darkness required to reach it. And he knew something else. Something that might matter to you if you're reading this in the middle of your own threshold. The fact that you're in this place at all means your psyche has already determined that you're strong enough to survive the crossing. The dissolution wouldn't be happening if you didn't have the psychological resources to withstand it. Your unconscious mind doesn't destroy structures it's not ready to rebuild. The demolition itself is evidence of capacity. That's worth sitting with for a moment. The very thing that feels like proof that you're falling apart is actually evidence that something inside you is strong enough to rebuild from the ground up. The psyche doesn't initiate the nigredo in someone who can't handle it. Jung was clear about this. The transformation chooses people who are ready, even when, especially when, those people don't feel ready at all. If you're standing in that threshold right now, and you're looking for a way to work with this process rather than just endure it, our guide, True Self-Discovery, might be exactly what you need. It's built around Jung's framework for exactly these moments. 24 reflection exercises designed to help you hear what your psyche is trying to tell you during the dismantling, so you can participate in your own transformation instead of just white-knuckling through it. You'll find the link below. So what does the best chapter actually look like when it arrives? Jung's answer to this question surprised even his most devoted followers. Because he didn't describe the new chapter in terms of external circumstances. He didn't talk about better relationships, better careers, better material conditions, though those often followed naturally. What he described was an internal shift so fundamental that it changed the person's entire relationship with being alive. He described people who, after completing the threshold crossing, developed what he called a relationship with the self, a felt sense of being rooted in something deeper than their social identity, something that couldn't be taken away by job loss or relationship failure or the opinions of others, a center of gravity that existed independent of external circumstances and that gave them a quality of presence that other people could feel but couldn't quite name. These people moved differently through the world. They made decisions from a different place, from inner alignment rather than external pressure. They could tolerate uncertainty because they'd survived the ultimate uncertainty of not knowing who they were. They could be alone without being lonely because they'd discovered that the companionship they'd been seeking from others was available from within. They could engage with life fully without being desperate, because their sense of okayness was no longer dependent on outcomes. Jung noticed that these people also developed a tolerance for complexity that others lacked. They could hold contradictions without needing to resolve them. They could see the darkness in good things and the beauty in difficult things. They'd lost the need for simple narratives about their lives, the need for everything to be either good or bad, right or wrong, success or failure. Life became richer and more textured for them because they'd stopped flattening it into categories. And perhaps most significantly, they developed a different relationship with time. They stopped living in anticipation, always reaching for the next achievement, the next milestone, the next proof that their life was working. And they stopped living in regret, constantly reviewing past decisions for evidence of mistakes. They became more present than they'd ever been, because the threshold had taught them that the present moment was the only place where real life actually happened. Everything else was just the mind's story about the past or fantasy about the future. This is what Jung meant when he talked about the best chapter of a person's life. He meant the chapter where they finally stop performing and start living, where the energy that used to go into maintaining appearances gets redirected into genuine experience, where relationships are built on truth rather than need, where work serves something deeper than ego, where the question, "Who am I?" has been replaced by the lived experience of actually being yourself, maybe for the first time. And the doorway to that chapter, the only doorway, according to everything Jung observed, runs directly through the darkness you're in right now, through the loss, the confusion, the dissolving of everything familiar, through the gap that feels like it will swallow you whole, through the terrifying freefall of not knowing who you are or what comes next. There's no way around it. Jung looked for one his entire career and never found it. The darkness is the path. The falling apart is the coming together. And the worst period of your life, the one you're maybe living through right now, the one where nothing makes sense and everything hurts and you can't see a single reason to believe things will ever feel different. That period is doing something you can't perceive from inside it. It's clearing the ground, preparing the soil, making space for something that your old life, for all its carefully constructed achievements, never had room for. You standing at this threshold, exhausted and confused and grieving what's falling away, that's what the beginning of the best chapter feels like before you can see it as a beginning. It feels like an ending, every single time. For every person Jung ever studied, the beginning felt like an ending first. Your only job right now is to keep standing, to resist the pull back toward what's familiar but finished, to tolerate the not knowing for one more day, and then one more after that. To trust that the emptiness you feel is not the absence of meaning, but the space where meaning that's actually yours, meaning not inherited, not performed, not borrowed from anyone else's idea of what your life should look like, is slowly, quietly, in the darkness, gathering the strength to emerge. The best chapter of your life begins with the willingness to let the old one end. And if you've been feeling that ending, in your body, in your relationships, in the hollowing out of everything you thought you wanted, then you're already closer than you think. Jung spent his life studying this moment, and everything he found points to the same truth. The transformation doesn't announce itself with trumpets and light. It announces itself with silence, with loss, with the unbearable feeling of standing on ground that's shifting beneath your feet. That shifting is the beginning. You're already in it, and the chapter waiting on the other side, the one your psyche has been building toward in every dream, every restless night, every inexplicable urge to walk away from the life you built. That chapter is closer than the darkness would have you believe. Stay in the threshold. Let the old story end, and pay attention, because what emerges from this silence is going to be more real than anything you've lived before. If you haven't yet, take a look at our guide, True Self-Discovery, 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's work, built for exactly the kind of moment you might be standing in right now. A way to start listening to what's trying to come through, instead of drowning it out. The link is right below this video.